I think it's worth saying here that when you start a company, you are risking a lot. You're risking years of your life. You're risking financial capital. Like there's a lot of ways. If it doesn't work out, it's going to be bad and it's going to be painful. And so my thought process was, hey, I know the downside is going to be really painful, but the upside's worth it. And you have to think that way. I think to do entrepreneurship at all, you have to believe that what we can create is so worth pursuing that if I have to risk a lot to get to that. And in some ways it was like, well, if I'm already putting up all this money, I should leverage every single possible thing. I should bring everything I can to the table to give this the best chance of success.
Mike, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be with you, man.
You said something at lunch that I think would be a great place to start. And one thing you said, I said, I had done a lot of research on you. And you said, well, tell me what you gathered from the research. And then you said something, you said, one of the greatest things about starting a company is you get to make the rules. And then what I told you was some of the things that I had noticed in doing research was the way you thought about starting Simple Modern was way different than most folks had started. So I thought we would start there. When you were starting Simple Modern and you got to create the rules, how were you thinking about what those rules would be?
Yeah. So the observation that I made is that usually when people are creating companies, they're just trying to figure out, how do I make money? And fortunately, I was at a point in my career where I had been a part of some successful ventures. And so I wasn't as hyper-focused on how much money I can make. I had realized that actually all of these other things, the qualitative things around a company, the culture that you're a part of, who you work with, what you're doing, the impact that the company was able to make outside of finances, that all that stuff actually really matters when it comes to experientially how much you enjoy it as a founder. And I mean, this entrepreneurship is just hard. You put a pound of flesh into anything you build. And so I just felt like, okay, if I'm going to build something, I want it to be something that I want to be a part of. And I want to get my money's worth out of like the time and the effort and the passion that I'm trading in. And so I kind of took stock at what would that even look like? If you could just draw it up however you'd want it to look like, what would that be? It doesn't matter if it's atypical. Like this is another great thing about entrepreneurship is that there's tremendous freedom to build companies however you want, as long as you can satisfy market demand and you can make it cash flow positive. It can look, however you want. And what I came back to was really a couple of core things. Who I do things with dictates my enjoyment, my satisfaction, probably even more than what I do. This isn't true for everybody. There's some people where it's like, hey, if I'm not doing, something quantitative, then I'm just not going to be happy. But for me and my personality type, it was certainly true that, hey, if I'm with the right people, I could work on an assembly line if I had the right coworkers, probably, and be happy. And so who I surrounded myself with was going to be a big part of it. And it makes sense. Like when you build a startup, there's so many hours and there's so much stress and tension and learning that who you build it with matters a ton. The other thing that I felt really strongly about, I'm sure we'll get into this. Basically, my career has got two halves. There's kind of a nonprofit half and a for-profit half. During the nonprofit half, I had literally had stretches where I raised my salary, and I was a terrible fundraiser, by the way. But I had like my first year out of college, I raised my salary of $18,000, and I struggled to raise that $18,000 salary. So when I left the nonprofit world, one of the indelible marks that left on me was that there are great people doing important work in the nonprofit world. And if I was going to be in the for-profit world, I wanted to be able to funnel resources towards people doing significant things. So I knew that generosity and giving, I wanted that to be a part of it. There were some examples out there, the Toms of the world, kind of like ideas. People were starting to kind of experiment with, hey, is there a way to kind of have business as a mission or to have kind of stakeholder mindset where like it's not just about the shareholders? Those were probably the two biggest things. And then the one other piece is you have to have some kind of perspective on like, how am I going to do well in the market? What are the competitive advantages I have? At that point, I'd been a part of a really large amount of sales in e-commerce. And so I knew that myself and my co-founders, we were really good at e-commerce. We knew that Amazon was ascending. We knew that e-commerce was probably the future. I think even in retrospect, 8-9 years ago, this was 2015 at the time, it's become even more true that e-commerce is a great place to be positioned, and it's probably just as true today as it was then. I've told people that building the company did not seem like a sure thing. In fact, a lot of people thought it was kind of a stupid idea based on the market we picked and stuff. What's funny is 20 or 30 years from now, I'm sure people will look at what we built and say, oh, it was so obvious. You started selling on Amazon in 2015 and you picked a great category. Any idiot could have pulled that off. And maybe that's true. Didn't feel that way at the time, but we did know that we wanted to be using some of those e-commerce skills that probably gave us the best chance to succeed.
Okay. So you wanted to start with folks that you wanted to work with.
Yeah.
But you wanted that before you even wanted to know what you would be selling.
Absolutely.
So you kind of got the gang together. These are guys that you had worked with. How did you kind of get to, this is what we're going to sell? What was the process? Was it process by elimination? Because what you landed on at the time, and like you just said, it's easy to look back and go, well, that was an easy category. You picked a cup or a thermal mug.
Yeah.
At a time when Yeti had just owned the space.
Yeah.
So how'd you get there?
Well, where we started was we knew that there was a real opportunity to sell on Amazon and that we were good at e-commerce. So we started asking the question okay, what could we sell? What would be some different products we could do? And we actually had a weekend where everybody was going to brainstorm a list and we were going to come back together and compare them. And I just can't overstate that there were some truly terrible ideas. Bankruptcy, if this was a choose your own adventure, 40 of the 60 ideas led to bankruptcy. But insulated drinkware was one of the things on the list. And we had a few different criteria we were looking for. And one was that we wanted something there was a lot of volume for, that we knew people were going to buy the product. In some ways, it's a lot easier if people want to buy the thing that you have. Now, what comes with that, the trade-off, is there's going to be competition. And that was really what made it seem suicidal from the outside. Everybody looking in, it was just you have got to be out of your mind to think that you can go in and compete with all these established companies. You're so undercapitalized compared to them. We bootstrapped. So, at Yeti at this point is rampaging. They're probably worth hundreds of millions, if not more at that point. There's Hydro Flask and Camelback and Contigo. And just list goes on and on. It's a really interesting particular vertical because it's one of the most fragmented consumer verticals that exists. Nobody owns more than 10% of the unit volume in the vertical. And so we were basically walking into the most cutthroat market that existed. Even the technology, if you want to call it that this is built on, the thermal insulation, that's something that's out of patent. So it's truly what I loved about it was, hey, I know a lot of people want to buy this and that's going to be going on forever. If Warren Buffett has this, saying that people always, or maybe it's Bezos that says, people want to know what is going to change in the next 10 years. And I'm really interested in what's not going to change. Or Warren Buffett has this thing about if you went to space for 50 years and you came back, what would be the same? I'm pretty sure people are going to be drinking water, right?
Yeah.
So in that respect, it's big market, lots of people, it's not going anywhere, crazy competitive. And to be an entrepreneur, as you know, you have to have a confidence that it's borders on irrational belief in yourself. It's kind of naive to some extent. And if you didn't have that, you'd never start because you would know the odds and you would just decide that you shouldn't do it. So we allowed the potential of the market to probably be the dominant factor we looked at. And the other thing that we had was we had an observation about the actual vertical that at this point, Yeti was still selling stainless steel. We realized that, hey, this is probably going to turn into a fashion product or a functional fashion product like a watch or a wallet or shoes where, yes, people buy it to do a thing, but also because of how it looks. I think even for us, we didn't know which of those it was likely to be. Is it likely to be a purse where you have two, or is it likely to be like shoes where you might have 20? And the thing that's probably caught us off guard in a good way has been the categories turned more into a shoe category where, as everybody listening, probably knows, and I'm sure this is the case at your house, you end up having 50 of these things in your cabinet. And so we were fortunate. We, in retrospect, you always want to say, hey, we had it all figured out. We did not. But we had at least, I think, the kernels of the right insights when we were getting started.
Was there anything, just to be clear, that you tried that didn't work before you got to?
Yeah. So our first couple products, we did a tea infuser, and then we did a silicone baking mat, and we made literally dozens of dollars. But they gave us just enough confidence that, hey, there's something here, and we could do this. And then along the way, we've tried lots of stuff that didn't work for one reason or another. We've had a real bias towards launching products, and one of the reasons it's fairly obvious once you say it, but from the outside, I don't think it's as obvious to people, is that consumer products companies are very asymmetric. If I come up with the design for this water bottle and buy 1,000 of them and it doesn't work, I might be at $100,000. But if it works, it might be $100 million product line or $1 billion product line. And because then I can make that bottle and I can just hammer it out one after another. And so it's uniquely asymmetric. In some ways, launching products is a little bit like the VC model, where you're not really worried about your zeros. It only is important that you catch some of the real winners. So we've had a bias towards trying things and trying to be okay with failure and things not working, because that's how you get the things that work. And Amazon's platform was really great because a couple things. One is, traditional retail, there's gatekeepers basically that you have to go through. Like, if you're the buyer, I have to go and convince you as the buyer at Target or something why you want my thing on the shelf. And even then, let's say I go into a meeting and I do convince you, it still might be 18 months before it actually gets on the shelf. It's gonna be at least a year. It just moves much more slowly. With Amazon, there's no gatekeeper, and you can move basically as quickly as you can make this stuff. So we could come up with an idea and create a mold and have it shipped within, 90 days, and then be trying it and selling it digitally. So the feedback loops of getting information and figuring out what was working and what wasn't, we were really fast at that. And that agility really helped us to maybe compensate for some of the areas where we were never going to be as good as our competitors. We didn't have the capital. We didn't have the scope. We didn't have the marketing budget. I mean, this is another thing worth mentioning, is that we just didn't have the money to be able to spend millions of dollars on awareness campaigns. So we had to figure out, how do we acquire customers inexpensively? And that led us to the strategy of really approaching all of these existing sales channels and figuring out how to leverage all these existing sales channels. And it is part of, I think, strategically why the company's done so well.
I just thought of this, but I'm thinking of this cup. I'm looking at it, and you guys have been selling it for 9 years.
Yeah.
And do you all you probably have a team that's focused around that cup, probably like a product team. Like, are you constantly looking at it going, how do we make it better? Do we change the shape? Obviously you can wrap it in different designs. Maybe we make it to where the water comes out a little better. Or do you just get to a point where, like, it's good how it is and all we're going to focus on is selling? The question's in the essence of, like, it's something so simple. How much thought do you have to put in the product year after year after year? So
in our particular product category at this point, I think there was a period where the product was getting a lot better, and the market was kind of figuring out what it wanted. At this point, it's really clear people want to drink out of straws. 90% of the time, that's what people want. Whether it's a tumbler or a water bottle or whatever, they want something like a straw. Whereas early on, that wasn't obvious. It was like maybe people just kind of want to
Yeti
drink.
had that little like slider thing.
Yeah, exactly. But now, like, most of what you see in the market incorporates a straw in some way. So there were some things like that weren't obvious at first. But at this point, I think it's more about creating different looks than it is better looks, because we've got products that work great, but because it is more of like a fashion trend category.
Yeah.
This is a good example this last year with the Stanley thing, is that they had this huge 40-ounce thing and put a big plastic handle on it. And the first time I saw it, I was, frankly, I was like, that's ridiculous. Like, that is just an absurd amount of water. And that thing is big and clunky. But really our market research said, for whatever reason, this is gaining steam, and our customers really like this. And so we developed our own version of this, which is a great product. I'm really proud of it. I think it's the best product out there, and it's propelled a lot of our success. But, 3 years from now, it'll be something different.
Yeah.
You know, whatever's really hot right now, it's going to look a little bit different. And 2-3 years from now. And so you're trying to stay on the front end of that and be positioned. One of the analogies I'm using with my team right now is that, you know, we can't control the wind, which would kind of represent the trends of what people want and kind of the viral nature of demand. But what we can do is kind of position ourselves in the water and have our sail up so that, you know, when the wind shifts, we're ready to take advantage and we're going to capitalize. So that means exactly what you said. You're coming up with a lot of ideas. You're making a lot of molds. And we do a lot of work with internally and externally with partners to continue to come up with new ideas and try and have the best products.
If you just took the Stanley example, which I think I told you is like my 7-year-old daughter wanted one thing for Christmas, a cup.
Right.
I was like baffled by it. What does that tell us about the consumer? That they wanted a handle, that they liked having more water? Like, what did the data suggest that if you had to imply why could something like that become so popular out of almost nowhere?
Yeah, so I have a theory. Nobody knows is the first answer.
Okay.
And I think it's kind of a head scratcher for a lot of people. I've talked to a lot of people in and around the industry. I think even in consumer products, Stanley is kind of the story of 23.
Yeah.
And everybody's kind of, what's interesting is the company sold in 2019 or 20, I think. And it was not an easy sale process. Like people were not excited about buying that brand. And then just kind of from the grave, this 100-and-something-year-old brand all of a sudden caught complete fire. And so it caught a lot of people off guard. But one of the things that in retrospect, I think clearly was happening was that there was this trend towards having more fluid, and there was this post-COVID, people are going to be in their cars a lot more and they're going to be moving around a lot more. And I think that probably set the stage where there was going to be something that was pretty big, that was cup holder friendly, that kind of became the thing. And for whatever reason, Stanley ended up being that thing. And so some of it, I really think is just a function of how society was moving around. Like we had a real demand shift that we saw right when COVID started, where people were who were buying water bottles all of a sudden just stopped buying water bottles because they weren't going anywhere. You know,
Right.
It was all tumblers, things that you'd have at your desk. And then similarly, all of a sudden when people are going to be moving around more, they want it to be bigger. They want it to be able to fit in their cup holder. So I think there was some of that. And certainly I think Stanley did a really good job of using influencer marketing. And that's something that's super, it's super interesting how different brands are leveraging that. So we're kind of dissecting it and looking at what they did and what's replicable and what's not. I also think that we've experienced this with TikTok and Instagram. There is, and you know this, you're on social media and like you write, 1,000 posts, and then the ones that go viral sometimes just are like head scratchers. Like, what in the world? That's the thing.
Yeah.
And there is a nature of, I think, randomness of what goes viral. And since you can't predict, you're really just looking for shots on goal. And so we had some of that last year where somebody posts something and, somebody shows one of our products and they're like, look, I can turn it upside down. It doesn't leak. And all of a sudden, it gets whatever 5 million views and your sales just explode. So in a world where social media does have this virality and randomness to it, a lot of what you're trying to do is increase your surface area of luck, and for good things to happen.
Humans are complex. The things that draw to us aren't always the most obvious things.
Yeah. Well, and they're herd animals. I mean, when it comes to your daughter doesn't need 40 ounces of water, probably. Right. I mean, it would probably be a lot for her to actually drink that.
She likes the cup because then we started putting stickers all over it. It became, like you said, a
Absolutely.
fashion item.
It's interesting. There's a couple of books, Innovator's Dilemma, Innovator's Solution, that are really good. But one of the things they talk about in there is that people hire a product to do a job. And for you to be really effective at selling, you have to understand what's the job that people are hiring my product to do. And so I can hire this product to help me not be thirsty or to help keep me hydrated. But another thing, like your daughter could hire a product to make her to communicate status or to communicate, something about her personality. And that's certainly happening in our category as well. Like whether it's the ornamentation and the colors, and I want this to match with my outfit and I want to come across as trendy, or it's, I want to have this particular brand because I feel like this signals a certain thing to my friends or whatever else. So there's actually a number of things that people will hire this product to do for them, which is part of the reason why the category's gotten a lot bigger than probably anybody would have guessed.
Yeah.
You know,
Have you done any influencer marketing?
we've done just a little bit, but we're really just starting to dip our toe in because for years, like I said, we just didn't have the budget. I mean, like it's like sometimes you want to look back and you want to say, oh, we were so smart, but really the reality was you didn't have any choices to begin with. We didn't have the options. The average direct-to-consumer brand will spend somewhere between 25 and 50% a lot of times of their revenue in marketing. Historically, we've spent 2 or 3%. So we didn't have the money. If we were going to be able to grow, when you have an inventory business, you got to fund the growth.
Yeah.
So if I want to grow from 10 million this year to 20 million next year, I've got to go and buy all that inventory before any of the sales show up. And that's really expensive. So it basically requires taking all my capital, all my profits, rolling that all in inventory, and then hoping that you sell it. So for years, that's really where we've been. We've just kind of gotten to the point where it makes sense for us to start to dip our toe in some of this other stuff. But part of our strategy was, if we don't have money for marketing, let's make this so inherently attractive, either through the colors we choose or the price points or whatever else, the quality, where we don't have to do a lot of telling people why they want to buy this, because otherwise, like there's no way for us to compete with Yeti, who has a, whatever, $300 million, $500 million marketing budget. We got to make it inherent in the product. And so like, that's an example sometimes that people don't think about, is pricing is like a form of marketing. And so as a result, like our margin structure, Yeti's public, you can go out there and look at their numbers. Our margin structure last year, we have like an industry leading margin structure, which people would be shocked by, because you look at our price points and it would be like, well, how are they doing that? Part of the reason is that we're not spending a lot of money convincing people they need to buy our product.
Okay. Back to creating your own rules. One thing you said, was that you didn't risk just money. Your first 15 hires were for 13 or 14 were basically friends that you had made along the way.
Yeah.
And if you spend time on Twitter, sometimes you'll read that tweet every now and again, somebody saying like, don't hire people you can't fire easily, or you can't break it off easily. You kind of are breaking that rule, but you get to create your own rule. Tell me how you came to that conclusion.
So in general, when you're starting a business, what you're doing is you go out and you just amass all the capital that you can. So that's financial capital, intellectual capital, relational capital, whatever you got. Basically, it's like literally like, what can you muster for the mission? And so I put a lot of my life savings in as the bootstrap money. But as you mentioned, the other thing I did is I really went to all of the smartest people. And there, I guess I should say it this way. There's smart people that I knew that weren't a part of the company, but people that I felt like well equipped and well situated to be a part of the company. And I went to all of them and personally recruited them to the company. And was that smart? Was that stupid? Could that have blown up in my face? Absolutely. Like, I think it's worth saying here that when you start a company, you are risking a lot. You're risking years of your life. You're risking financial capital. Like, there's a lot of ways. If it doesn't work out, it's going to be bad and it's going to be painful. And so my thought process was, hey, I know the downside is going to be really painful, but the upside's worth it. And you have to think that way. I think to do entrepreneurship at all, you have to believe that what we can create is so worth pursuing that if I have to risk a lot to get to that. And in some ways it was like, well, if I'm already putting up all this money, I should leverage every single possible thing. I should bring everything I can to the table to give this the best chance of success. So that was part of it, is that like, hey, like going and recruiting somebody who knows me, I've got a better shot at a yes of an A plus level candidate than just some random person, that just graduated from MBA or is coming from hot startup X. Like, if they don't know me, what are my chances of recruiting them to my insulated drinkware company that they,
in Norman, Oklahoma?
So yeah, there's a funny aside. I teach at OU. I'm an entrepreneur in residence at the Entrepreneurship College. And during this time that I'm starting the company, I'm also teaching about entrepreneurship. And one of the classes that I taught in, I would teach in it once every semester. And the teacher said, hey, it'd be great. The beginning of the class, I always have a group look at a potential startup and then kind of deconstruct it and say whether or not they'd invest in it. why don't we give them simple modern before you speak? But we won't tell them it's your company. So I go into this class and I watch about 15 minutes of, 19-year-olds just tell me my idea sucks. I mean, they just give all the reasons why I'm going to get crushed, by Yeti or whatever. And so anyway, then I teach the entire lesson. And at the end, I'm like, hey, actually, that was my company. And here's some additional details you didn't know. And the class is like, well, wait a minute. Can we, we want to change our mind. And I'm like, no, you're dead to me. But it's like, it was a really funny, because it was just a microcosm of like, if you didn't believe in me personally or know something about my track record, the idea was not inherently a winner on the surface, which, this is a lot of entrepreneurship. It's like very rarely is the idea so good that you're definitely going to win with it. It's about execution. I mean, you will see this all the time online. What's more important, the idea or execution? And it's like, it's the execution, right? Yep. It's the doing. So by going to people that I knew, I was actually able to go to people that like knew my ability to execute, my ability to lead. But the other piece, and I know we want to get into this, is I wanted to build a particular type of culture when it came to values. And the only way that I knew to do that was to go and get people who I had personally seen that demonstrated in their lives. And not just for like a little period of time, but for an extended period of time. So yeah, the first 15 hires, 14 out of the 15 were people that I had known for a decade or more and had seen them really walk out the things that we wanted to be about for an extended period of time. So again, go back to this idea of risk, right? Well, sure, I took on more risk by bringing on people that if I had to let them go, it was going to be painful. If the company went bankrupt, like a lot of my close friends were now going to be out of a job. But think about the risk that I traded in. I didn't have the risk of getting people who weren't aligned, or getting people in the company where after 6 months you realize, wow, this person really can't pull their weight. They really don't belong here. So a lot of times I think in terms of trade-offs, and I just kind of came to the conclusion that, hey, the trade-offs are worth it. Yes, you're giving up some things when you bring in people that you have relationships with, but you gain a whole bunch of things also. And fortunately for us, it's worked out.
Do you think that puts a different type of pressure on you?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think absolutely, like the importance of maintaining those relationships, but also, to go back to this idea of trade-offs, my biggest risk I felt like going into the business is that I would eventually become a person that I didn't want to be. Operating at the level that we are talking about operating businesses out, it requires a very particular type of person, a particular type of drive. It can really gravitate towards transactionality and ego and pride, and a whole bunch of things that I didn't want to be true of my character, or at least not dominantly true of my character. And so not only was I bringing in people where I knew they had the ability and I knew they had the character, but I also brought in people that knew me well enough that they would be willing to say hard things to me. And this is an important thing. I wanted people that respected me, but were not in awe of me, that were willing to say, hey, you shouldn't have said that. Hey, like that was not, I did not like how you handled that. Whereas somebody that you go and hire off the street, they might not give you that feedback.
Yeah.
And so interestingly, when I think about the last 8 or 9 years of building the company, the person that I've developed into, a large part of that is that I've been surrounded by people that care about me enough and have enough relationship with me that they've had the hard conversations. I mean, I had one really early on, just as an example here, of airing my own dirty laundry. One of my co-founders, Brian Porter, who is also, active on Twitter and kind of one of the more authoritative voices in e-commerce, and is about as much about selling on Amazon as anybody. Brian had worked with me and under me at the previous company that we had worked at, and now we were co-founders. So all of my track record and experience with Brian had been him as basically somebody who reported to me. There was a little bit of a power dynamic there. And we started this company, and I realized about 2 years in, thanks to some feedback from him, that a lot of times I was treating him like a subordinate. He was my partner. He was a co-founder, but I was not treating him that way. And, Brian is a very humble guy and he's a very gentle guy, but he was able to help me to understand the way that I was treating him and how it was making him feel, which led to a huge correction from me. And it was kind of a light bulb moment of like, wow, okay, I've got a blind spot here. And so now we really, we have a very different relationship than in the earliest days. But you know what it required, Chris, is it required me being willing to hear that from him and him being willing to say that. And a lot of times you just don't have that kind of relational equity in startups for people to give that kind of feedback. So I think one of the things that I'm the most proud of with Simple Modern is that usually when you build a company like this, there are bodies in the wake, and we don't really have those. But a lot of the reason we don't have them is not because we're perfect people or better people. It's because there's been a lot of apology. There's been a lot of, conflict resolution. There's been a lot of hard conversations. I mean, perfect companies don't exist because perfect people don't exist. Everybody has flaws and everybody has their things that are difficult to work with. But it is really powerful when you're surrounded by people that are willing to, be for you and call you up instead of call you out and tell you these things. And so that's been one of the gifts I think I've taken from Simple Modern is that I've grown, and I've grown as a result of people speaking into my life.
Okay, I think this would be a good spot to sidebar. So you've mentioned nonprofit a few times, and when we get back to the business conversation, we're going to talk about what's kind of happened since. But you kind of created your own rules. You've mentioned nonprofit. You're the first person to come on that was basically a pastor.
Yeah.
For 10 years before getting into entrepreneurship, which there's not many circumstances where being a pastor leads you to getting into business. Right. So I think let's just spend a little bit of time on what do you think you took from that 10 years in the nonprofit pastor world that kind of is infused into the company today? I mean, I think we've talked a lot about them. One, like, how did you even make the transition?
Mm-hmm.
And what did that part of your life do for the company you're running today that continues to go on today?
Yeah, absolutely. I have joked frequently that if you at 22 said, at 44, I want to have this big company that I'm, CEO and co-founder of, what would you do right out of college? And I think that, go to work for a nonprofit Christian ministry where I raise my salary would not be on the list. It wouldn't be far down the list. It wouldn't be on the list. And yet, ironically, I think it has been uniquely responsible for the success that I've had and the way that I've dealt with the success. So, as you mentioned, right out of college, college was a big period for me. Even though I grew up kind of in the Bible Belt and around church, this was not an important thing to me when I went to college. I was in college for 5 years. Halfway through college, had a major life change moment. I became a Christian and completely changed my worldview. I think reshaped my dream for what I hoped my life would be about. It was a big part in who I married. And so I was still thinking I was going to do finance. I was a finance major. I still thought I was going to do that at graduation. My wife had one more year of school in a master's degree she was doing in accounting. And so I knew I was going to be in Norman, and I got an opportunity to do a 1-year internship. I said yes to it and really just kind of was shocked by how much I enjoyed investing in other people. I think you and I share this in common that we're achievers and we're driven to accomplish things and build things. So it was a new experience for me, like that my job, like that success was actually like investing in other people's lives and pouring into other people's lives. And it shocked me even more that I loved it. I think in some ways because it pushed me towards a version of myself that I liked better, maybe than the hyper driven, version of myself that I'd seen previously. And so what ended up happening is 1 year turned into, hey, I'll do this one more year. I'll do 2 years. And then that turned into my wife saying like, hey, I actually like what you're doing better than what I'm doing in accounting, and us doing it together for 7 more years. And so my 20s ended up being fully devoted to nonprofit work, ministry work. And, some of the things that came out of that, one was that my wife and I think when we established what our marriage was going to be about, we made a decision fairly on. Well, it's not going to be about, possessions or acquiring stuff or status, because I can't overstate this. There's not a lot of status, possessions, or income, in being in
18,000 a year.
Yes, it was. And I'll tell you a funny aside here. So even as I'm doing this, I was still investing because I still had this financial part of my brain and some gifting there. And I had a full ride to OU. So I graduated with college. I didn't have any debt and I had $20,000. So our first year of marriage, I'm making $18,000, but I have this $20,000 saved up and I decide I'm going to invest this in one stock. I'm going to go totally concentrated. I'm going to buy one stock. And I finally find the stock I want. I put it all in. And you know what? It was a good choice. It was a good choice. The stock, I think, triples. And we get to that spring. My wife and I really wanted to buy a house. The place we lived our first year, we lived in the Hillcrest Estates, which the thing that was the most significant thing about the Hillcrest Estates is it had the unique designation of being the cheapest place you could live in Norman, Oklahoma. And so that's why we were there. We were in this place, but we wanted to move into a house. We found this for sale by owner house, $105,000. And this is 2004. So this is like when the market totally lost its mind. Go to the bank and the bank says, the only way we'll give you this loan, because Heather hadn't started working yet and I had an $18,000 salary. They said, the only way that we'll give you this loan is if you put 40% down on the house. Or maybe it was 50%. It was a big enough number. It was like, you've got to be kidding me. And the only way I could make that 40 or 50% was if I sold the stock. And so I tell people that the most expensive house I'll ever buy was my first house because I sold what would today be about $40 million worth of Netflix stock to do the down payment on my first house. So there you go. I don't know what the moral of that story is other than I sold a bunch of Netflix stock in 2004. But anyway, so we obviously weren't in it for any of those things. We got very motivated by the idea of making an impact in people's lives. And I think it can't be overstated that the dream that you have for your life, where will meaning, purpose, satisfaction comes from, that is a very, very important piece to having a fulfilled life, is that you have a clear vision. If you don't have a clear vision of where those things come from, then I don't know how you could possibly hope to experience it. And so all of that stuff, we got clarity of thought, I think, as a couple about those things fairly early on. And even now, with how we're situated, it's different. We're situated pretty differently. But I still think back about some of those days were great. Like living in that crappy apartment. We had our date night was we got off work and we went and bought a $5 Little Caesars Hot and Ready and we watched something on free TV and it was great. And so it was formative that I think I realized okay, my circumstances, my possessions aren't going to dictate my happiness and they're not going to dictate how purposeful I feel. So one of the big things when I finally did move into the business world is that I knew that the money and that the stuff wasn't going to be what did it for me. It wasn't going to bring the satisfaction that I was hoping for. And so I think that was really helpful. The other thing that I took from working in ministry is I got very good at reading people. I mean, really, you and I just had an awesome, conversation before this. I literally all day. You did great. I mean, it was, well, what was great about it, Chris, is that you're an authentic person, and all I did every day for 9 years was I just sat across the table from people and I talked to them. And so you learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about people. You learn a lot about how to, be a judge of people. And so that was really powerful. I learned a lot about sales, you don't think about it, but using your words to persuade other people is just a superpower, right? When I can help you to see where you want to be in the gap and how you can get there. And so I never thought about myself as a salesperson, but then whenever we started Simple Modern, I'm in these meetings with, the Targets and the Walmarts and Sam's Club of the world. And my ability to sell was really pivotal in us getting several yeses early on. And a lot of that came from that period. So, but I think finally the biggest thing is, I think your 20s are about establishing the foundation of who you are, your character and where you're headed. And I don't think that I would have managed the success of the last 15 years very well if it weren't for those years. There's an analogy that I'll use sometimes We haven't really talked through the whole 15 years of business yet, but the very first venture that I was a part of got very big, very quick. And it was overwhelming. It was like just a force of nature, like the way that it happened and how quickly it happened and the way that it impacted people. And I was searching for like an illustration. How do I communicate to people what it's like? The rush. You know what it's like when it's just like, wow, just like everything is working. This is so overwhelming. It's like intoxicating. And on Oahu, there's a beach that for whatever reason, the waves just crash, like these huge waves crash right on the shore. And I don't know what the official name of it is. I can't remember, but the nickname they have for it is Breakneck Beach. And the reason they call it Breakneck Beach is because a lot of people break their neck on the beach every year. And anyway, so we, being a 20-something-year-old guy, I'm like, well, I must swim in it, of course. So I would go, you go out there and these waves, they were so powerful that if you're just standing on the shore, when the wave comes in, it'll just rip you right off your feet and it'll just suck you out. And like, there's this very short period of time of like maybe 3 or 4 seconds where the water stops going out and pulling you out before the big wave hits, where if you want to get out of the water, you basically have to sprint and try and beat the next wave. But a lot of times you wouldn't get out of the water and the next wave would hit you and suck you right back out. And I use that as an illustration of what it's like to have a business that's really successful, is that for the first time you feel like, wow, there's this force and it's almost overpowering, and you can lose yourself, right? You can lose perspective, you can lose bearing, you can you find yourself saying things like, I never thought I would say that, or I would ever get that frustrated or that stressed or whatever. And so going through, really building companies in hypergrowth for many years, at times it has been overwhelming, but having some kind of a compass and foundation to work through has been really helpful.
Okay, then let's talk about hypergrowth, because you mentioned the first company, and then Simple Modern's been another one of those stories of just massive growth. What do you know about hypergrowth, or why do you think it's not luck, or what have you seen multiple times over and over that you think's creating that?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the easiest answers is just that I'm in kind of G1 of the internet, like that the internet makes exponential growth possible in a way that is really not been possible up until this point in human history. Our first business, we had our very first sale on October 23rd, 2009. By Thanksgiving of 2010, we had our first $1 million revenue day. I mean, you just think about that ramp, and like that's absurd how quickly things can ramp. Simple Modern has now gone from its first water bottle being sold in March of 2016 to a couple $100 million in annual revenue this year. So like that's a crazy ramp. But a lot of this is that the hyper scaling is possible because I'm really standing on the shoulders of what a lot of other people have built. So I think that the other side of that's also we're saying is that we're grappling with as a society, just as an aside, is that it's clear that what technology does is it makes the big winners even bigger winners, and it makes the power curve even more unweighted, or even more kind of extreme towards the end. There's always been a power curve of outcomes, but now it's even more extreme, where like when you win, you just knock the absolute cover off the ball. And then for a lot of people, it's like you don't get a great outcome, or you get a very middling outcome. So I've been fortunate enough to be in 2 or 3 situations where we had the right idea at the right time, and then the internet was kind of a backbone of it, and so the ability to scale it. So I think I've gotten good at scaling things. But there's another interesting kind of idea in here. You ever heard, a founder myth? Yeah, have you talked about this before? Okay,
No.
so like the founder myth is basically this idea that when you build something, that there's kind of the real story, and then there's the story that gets kind of told, like the kind of mythological version of like how things went, where you kind of, things were intentional, and, like maybe you omit some of the details, and you just kind of, you build it up to like be this, great story. And it's almost never true. And so a lot of times when we talk about when we talk about building a company like Simple Modern, or some of the things that I've been through, it's really easy to it's easy to build it up as something that it wasn't. And with my story, like you could look at it on paper and be like, wow, okay, like he's had basically 2 or 3 like massive success all in a run. Like that's crazy. Here's the part that people don't hear. I've been this close 10 other times probably and blew it somehow. Like, I mean, think about what happened from 2009 to 2024. Like the iPhone App Store basically came of age. The iPad didn't even exist, like just that one thing. Like I missed out on all that. I was right there and I missed out on everything App Store related. There were 1,000 ideas and my brother and I looked at many of them like, oh, what would be great is if there was an app that did this and then we didn't do it. And then you look up like 3 years later and you're like, oh yeah, they just raised it $1 billion valuation. Yeah. So like I actually think it's important to tell the story that way, where it's easy to be like, oh wow, hit, you must be great. And it's like, well, a better framing of it is I was in the proximity of opportunity a bunch, probably 15 or 20 times. I definitely started things that went to zero. I had other things where, man, if I had just, if I'd just taken a little bit different approach, it could have gone a lot better. But because I had enough kind of surface area of opportunity and enough at bats, I've had a couple of things where I really made contact with the ball, and then I've known what to do with it. Yeah. I think once we got that.
And on that App Store comment, do you think is there something in the world going on today that's like an App Store moment? Is it AI right now? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that they are going to look at right now, like probably this 10, 15, 20-year period we're in, as kind of an inflection point of human history. And it's interesting because I'm kind of a futurist. Like I tend to think, I tend to be the person that you ask, hey, what's going to happen 5 years from now, 10 years from now? That I just have the best track record of being able to do that. And for a long time, I've been able to kind of look out and feel like I can make predictions that had a very good chance of being true. I can't do that anymore. Like I think we are at a point where nobody knows what's coming next. It's interesting too, just to draw an association. Right now, the conspiracy theories have kind of like exploded. And I think there's a reason for it. And here's the reason why I think they've exploded. One is the internet's just made information more available and people are getting information from a bunch of different sources and they're skeptical. But here's, I think, actually the underlying driver is that people want to believe that there's a cohesion and an organization to the way things are happening in the world, that somebody somewhere, some shadowy figure somewhere, somebody's in control. And the truth is much more scary that no human's in control. Like what's going on here, if somebody's in control, it's God, but no government, no group of people is orchestrating what's happening. There's a lot of stuff happening all at once in a bunch of different places, and nobody is kind of the puppet master pulling the strings. And that's kind of a deeply unsettling thought, for most people. And that's kind of where we're at with AI. Like undoubtedly it is going to, I think my guess would be in the next 5 years, undoubtedly you're going to get 2 or 3 breakthroughs that are, mind-blowing in nature. Whether that's like, wow, we just eradicated Alzheimer's. Like just boom, like we just figured it out. AI helped us to get this breakthrough we would have never come to. And then 2 or 3 positives, and you're going to get 1 or 2 really negative ones. Wow, like that government just accidentally launched a nuke, something really terrible. I think it's almost inevitable that you're going to get a mixture. So we're living at this really interesting period where the future is undoubtedly going to look different. And AI is definitely going to create a ton of opportunity. And nobody knows exactly how it's going to go down. And then I think interestingly, as the world gets more and more digital, and this kind of speaks to what you do, I think the physical world in some ways may be the quickest appreciating asset. Like the things that technology can't do. If you really believe technology is just going to get exponentially better, then that actually makes all the things in the physical world it can't do just at a higher and higher premium. The jobs that robots can't do, that rely on people, that rely on judgment. And I think we saw this during COVID. We saw the first part of this. Everybody was like, oh, it's all digital. All that matters is the digital world. And then all the supply chains broke. And it was like, no, actually it's not. Like the physical world really, really matters. Yeah.
Are you excited about that as an entrepreneur? Like, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I probably have the balanced view of there are risks. And I think we tend to want to sit at our time in history and say we are the most intelligent and the most advanced in our thinking of anybody that's come. And when it comes to our technology, there's no arguments. We clearly are. But I'm not so sure that's true anywhere else. Like if you looked at levels of depression, in our society, and you compared them to, I don't know, Ireland 1,000 years ago, I would guess that even though they had significantly worse circumstances in a bunch of different ways, that you probably had lower, less depression. And there's a lot of I think concerning little data points that we have started to lose the scent a little bit as a society. I mean, when you talk about the amount of isolation that's going on and the way that technology seems to be kind of making people less and less connected with each other, like there's this quote I love. I think it's a former NASA president that said it, but like our ancestors were not all morons. Like they had really, really good thoughts about what we need to live a good life and what, it is to be a human and the needs that come with that. And the extent that we've kind of disconnected from some of those things, especially when it comes to relational connectedness, I think is like at our own peril. So that's the worry. The worry is that the places where we're walking away from the things that have been true of humans for, thousands, tens of thousands of years, like it's not likely to go well for us. But conversely, like, man, I mean, it's exciting to think about the way what might be possible, the suffering that could be eliminated, and the ways that the world could get better. Here's my kind of techno optimist view. My techno optimist view is that right now we're kind of at what I'll call like peak screens, which is technology is very present in our life, but in a very distracting way. You want to look at your phone, you want to get information. It's like you basically put a screen between you and I, and it breaks our communication or whatever. And so my optimistic view is that maybe technology recedes into the background. That is, it becomes more advanced, it becomes more embedded in our lives in a way that's not disrupting, connection. And so we'll see. I don't know, but that's what I'm hopeful for. But undoubtedly, historians are going to look back on this period and write extensively about, okay, when the internet first showed up, this massive disruption event. Let's just study all the things that happened. Let's study that first generation of people that they just put on social media. They put kids on social media at like 5 years old, and like, wow, look at what happened to their brains. Look at all the things we learned. Like, unfortunately, our generation, it's interesting. Like you'll hear phrases like being on the wrong side of history. I think everybody who's alive right now should kind of get comfortable with the idea that we're gonna probably be reflected on poorly by future generations. They're gonna be like, man, I cannot believe that they did that, or that they didn't know, how damaging this X or Y would be. So we're figuring it out, but it makes sense. It's like the internet has been the most disruptive event in human history, and AI is right on top of it. And so we're kind of figuring it out in real time.
Okay, I want to go to a story about licensing.
Yeah.
And you said the way I describe the licensing community to people, it's like a castle. There's a moat and the drawbridge is up. You're trying to get into the castle. They're shooting arrows at you, throwing rocks and boiling oil over the side. And then if you somehow get into the castle, then they're like, here's the throne for you. And they treat you great because you're making them money.
Yeah.
How did you start getting into licensing, and what do you know about licensing today that you didn't know when you started?
So this is one of the single greatest entrepreneurial stories I have from Simple Modern that I'll tell here. It's a story about bias to action and long odds and, doing whatever it takes. So I had this idea pretty early on, even before we'd sold a single drinkware unit, that like, man, if you could make insulated drinkware that was high quality and affordable prices with like, I lived in Norman, like OU on it, for example, like people would want to buy that. And when I looked out there, everything was either overpriced or it was crappy quality, usually both. So I thought, well, I'm going to look into it. And that was literally me getting on Google. I didn't know anybody in licensing. I knew nothing about anything. I get on Google, I search it up, and basically the extent of my research is I'm able to figure out on the collegiate level, there's a licensing kind of board that a lot of the universities kind of outsource the heavy lifting of this. They ask this board to kind of give them recommendations what to do, and they just do it. So the way to get licensed with that board, I found was like, it was impossible. They wouldn't talk to me. But they did have this very special carve out called a something like a local license. And the way that a local license worked is if your business was located within an X number of miles of a local university, you could go to the university and apply directly to the university for like just that university. So I'm like, hey, I teach at OU. Like I've been a part of some entrepreneurial success. Surely OU would give me a local license. No problem. I'll get that and then I'll figure it out. So, and let me just say right now, if you showed me the compound probability of failure, I would have never done this. I mean, to say it was 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, I mean, is maybe overstating my chances. It was extremely long odds, so long that the odds were so long that I would have never done it if I had known the odds, which, is like,
that's like entrepreneurship.
That's entrepreneurship, right? Like if you spend too much time thinking about why it won't work, you'll never do anything because, the deck is weighted against you. But I think I can do this. And so to apply for this local license, I had to create samples, and then I had to ship it off to an office in Atlanta, and then I had to find a way to get in contact with the licensing director at OU. So get China to make some samples, ship it off, and I submit the application, and I just don't hear anything from OU. I don't hear anything. I'm calling them, not hearing anything. Eventually it gets to the point where it's like, these people are they're going to ghost me. And so I start loitering basically around the licensing office. Like, can I bump into somebody at this point? I'm just like trying to get anybody to pay attention to me. I finally bump into somebody, and this is like the assistant. The assistant's like, okay, we'll set up a meeting. So I get a meeting set up, and basically this meeting is like for me to try and sell them on making me a local license, which I've come to find out, even though like I'm an alum and stuff, like is not by any means a sure thing. So I'm like, oh, well, how do I convince these people that I'm credible? Because in the licensing industry, there's all these people come in all the time. Like they've got big dreams. Oh, I'm going to do all this stuff. And they never do. It's all talk. So these licensors have kind of been conditioned to think people are just full of it and they're never going to follow through. We had not sold a water bottle at this point. So I'm like, how do I convince these people that I have credibility when I've literally got zero distribution? I've got zero revenue, zero anything. So here's what I did. I took the one product we had, which was a tea infuser. This is such a funny story. I took the tea infuser, I set up a Shopify website, and then I went on Google and I turned on a bunch of advertising that was super inefficient. I was losing my butt on every sale, but I turn it on right before I go into this meeting. And Shopify has an app that has the best push notification sound. Have you ever heard this?
No.
It's an old school cash register. Cha-ching. Cha-ching. It's the best push notification. I mean, you can imagine the dopamine you get when you're running an online store. You get a push notification. You just got to sell. It's the cha-ching. It's amazing. So anyway, I walk into this meeting. I've just ramped my ad budgets, and I intentionally leave my phone on full volume. So I go in there, and I'm starting the meeting with the licensing director, Candace, and my phone's going off, cha-ching, 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 and I'm just letting it happen.
Oh my
and then
God.
after about 5 minutes, I'm like, oh man, I'm so sorry. That's our online store. I guess we're just having a lot of sales. Let me put that on mute. And then I continued the meeting. But it was like, it's just such a great example of like, how do I appear, like kind of a pufferfish style? How do I appear that we have a business here when we don't really have much of a business? But anyway, I was able to, going back to what did I learn in the nonprofit world? I learned how to read people. I learned how to sell, and I was able to convince her to give us a local license. I took the local license, working with our overseas manufacturing partner. I made about 40 samples or 30 samples. And I thought if I can get in front of a mass retailer, I can pitch them on the vision. And I didn't know anything about mass retail either. So I called the one person I know who knew something, a guy I'd known from college who worked for a candy company and led up their sales to Walmart. He connected me with an agent, and that agent basically got me a meeting with Sam's Club. And I went into a meeting, and, this is where the kind of serendipity or luck piece of entrepreneurship comes in. What I did not know is this was the period where the Yeti, Rambler was so hot. And this buyer had just started selling Members Mark 2-pack stainless steel tumblers, and they were selling a pallet a day in Sam's Club. And so this buyer walks in the meeting like, I just have to buy more insulated drinkware. And I walk in with like literally these samples of a thing I've never sold and pitch her on this idea. And she was the sporting goods and the licensing buyer. And during that meeting, she basically said, I want to do 2 programs with you, and it would be about $8 million in sales if you can get the licenses. Which I didn't know at the time, but I was never going to get the licenses, or I shouldn't have thought I was going to get the licenses, but I'm like, great.
I'll go get them.
So yeah. So I call the organization that's in charge of all the licenses. I'm like, I'd love to meet with you about getting licensed. And they're literally like, it will not happen. There is no way. This has never happened. You're wasting your time. I'm like, will you please just set up a meeting? I finally convinced them to set up a meeting. I walk in there and give the presentation of my life. And at the end, the decision maker says to me, we have sat with 18 different drinkware companies in the last year that wanted to get licensed. And we've turned every single one down, but we're saying yes to you. And we're saying yes to you because you showed up with an $8 million PO, and you can't say no to that. And we got fully licensed with all of the universities. And then that turned into the following year, we got licensed with the NBA. And then that turned into Disney. And then that turned into the NFL. And now we're actually known as one of the biggest players in the licensing space. But it all started with convincing a single person at OU, before we'd sold a single piece of drinkware, that they should give me a local license. And it's just a great example of, I think, all the things that entrepreneurship takes, right? Just like, what do I have to work with? The ingenuity, the bias to action, the not getting intimidated by the odds. And so it's really fun to see where we've gotten. And now, of course, like people come to us, right? Like the licenses we're at are usually people coming to us, but certainly not that way at the beginning.
And then once you have the license for the drinkware, you can basically call them and say, we got a new cup.
Yep.
Let's license that. You can just start funneling products under the license.
Absolutely.
Program.
It's super interesting because it's intentionally a little bit like an oligopoly in that the licensors intentionally will only pick 3 or 4 people, and then they'll say, okay, Simple Modern, we want you to be our solution for Amazon. So when it comes to NFL drinkware on Amazon, I think there's only 2 companies that even have the right to sell it. So it was interesting because we were in an industry where like, hey, where are the competitive advantages? Where are the moats? And it was like, well, licensing could be a source of one of those. And fortunately, we were able to execute on that. Now, there's all kinds of challenges that come with that. But if you can get there, it's pretty great and it's pretty motivating.
Okay, let's call this next section moats.
Okay.
Because I was going to tie it into like, one thing you've said is that just selling on the internet, you were in G1, that allowed for hypergrowth. We've now been buying on the internet for how long? Probably 20, 25 years.
Yeah.
One question, are we still in G1 or have we moved to G2?
No, I think we're definitely getting past G1. I mean, in some ways we might even be in G3 or G4. Like G1, just to give you an example, this is like Google doesn't really know what they're doing yet. Facebook doesn't really know what they're doing yet. If you want to spin up a website, you go buy servers, and then you buy like a box in Atlanta with a lock on it that you put your servers in. And sometimes our servers would melt. Like we literally had times where our website got knocked offline because the server melted. Yeah. And like now in, world of AWS, like it's not the way that any of this stuff works. Like if you wanted to build a website, you wanted to build an e-commerce website, you built it. Like you hired developers and you custom built it. Whereas now I can go in for $15. I can have Shopify and a professional looking theme. So the upside of that is as the services and the use of the cloud has really exploded, it's made it much easier to start an internet business, and it's made the bar for success way higher. So early on, I think success had a lot to do with just can you market and being early. Now it's like, you've got to execute. We make this joke, people that are in the ecom profession, that like to be good at ecom, you have to be good at like 60 things. Like in some ways, it's like, I'm so envious of real estate. It's like real estate, you got to be good at 3 or 4 things and you got to be really good at them, but it's like, it's a limited list. E-commerce, it's like, well, okay, let me just tell you some of the things you need to know about. You need to know about digital marketing. You need to know about product development. You need to know about sourcing. You need to know about logistics. You need to understand, whatever tariffs. You need to have, a cursory understanding of sales tax law. You've got to be able to, understand lifetime user values. You've got to be able to deal with chargebacks and fraud. You've got to, and it's like 50 things when you start making the list of all the stuff that you've got to be at least somewhat competent. You got to have you got to legal. There's a lot of different things you have to know. And the positive of that was I described my early years as just like in the internet world as just like an MBA on crack. It's just like I learned about 15 things at the same time at a rate that you would probably never, intentionally do anything, but you're just drinking out of the fire hose. And I was forced to in order to be competent. And so built a lot of different subject matter expertise. And now we're in a stage where obviously mobile's been really disruptive. And I think there's a big question about, hey, what happens in the next generation and how does AI change things? The other big thing that's happened in, I think, e-commerce is that the amount of things being sold that are digital in nature just keeps going up, right? That a lot of what people buy, like if you, like my son, for example, we've got him on this app called Greenlight where he's got his own debit card and he earns his allowance for there and stuff. I bet he spends 70% of his money on digital goods. He saves up money and then he has like a game he plays on the Oculus and he uses it to buy, whatever, a certain avatar, or some kind of, character tool that he wants to have. And like, that was not when we were kids. That's not how we were, we were buying baseball card packs or something. So the normalization of buying digital goods is another piece. And honestly, I think it's very difficult to make money selling physical things on the internet. Is basically like a few years ago, there was kind of a gold rush where a lot of VC money went into D2C, direct-to-consumer companies. And right now, VCs basically view that as an uninvestable asset class. Like you can't do well doing that. And it's really hard. Customer acquisition costs are really high. Shipping is expensive. Returns are brutal. Like there's just a lot of reasons why it's very difficult. It's one of the things that makes Amazon so impressive, the way that they've been able to make it all work. And so a trend that I think you definitely will see is people are going to increasingly try and figure out like, how do I blend physical and digital things where I get margin profiles that work? Because just straight physical e-commerce is really challenging. Like if you go back to 2009, 2010, there were so many things that looked promising. It looked like you were going to have this really diverse e-commerce ecosystem. And you fast forward today and it's like, it didn't happen at all. Like Amazon ate it all. And even some companies like Walmart have really struggled with turning their kind of drop shipping e-commerce into a profitable, part of their business. So anyway, it's been really interesting to be a part of that entire evolution and to see what's probably coming in the next wave.
Is Amazon still taking more and more margin out of your products as you become more successful?
So there's 2 different ways you can sell on Amazon. You can sell on the marketplace, which is basically like consignment. It's like there's no gatekeeper. You show up, you're in charge. You can send them inventory however much you want. They have a whole fee structure, and they definitely, I think, are raising the bar for those sellers. They're asking them to be more and more competent in supply chain and demand forecasting and a bunch of that stuff. If you think about the marketplace and deconstruct what it is and how it works, Amazon had this kind of conundrum of, in an inventory-based world, how do we grow our selection and how do we keep pricing really competitive? And the marketplace was this just kind of genius stroke of like, well, what if other people financed it? What if, if we want to add whatever, $600 billion of inventory, what if instead of us paying for it, we got other people to pay for it instead? And so what that did is it allowed Amazon to have, just this incredible product selection and price competition. At this point, if you search water bottle on Amazon, you don't need 7,000 results. You're not going to go look at all those. You're not looking at page 8 of the search results. You need, I don't know.
Is anybody looking at page 8?
No. In fact, inside of Amazon, I've been told there's a joke that, where do you hide a dead body? On page 2 of the Amazon search results.
Yeah.
So I think Amazon's more aware of that, of like, hey, this kind of idea of the quote unquote endless shelf. We don't need an endless shelf. We just need, we need 30 or 40 really good options in some categories, a lot less than that. And so there's been this period of like total expansion. There's 12 million people that have sold on the marketplace. That's a lot of people. And now I think what you're seeing is they're just not so much, I don't see it as out of Amazon doing this out of greed or trying to, improve their profit margins as much as I see Amazon just raising the bar of who the sellers can be. We sell directly to Amazon. It's more of like a traditional wholesale relationship. And in our relationship with Amazon, our fee structure, I don't think has changed in several years, but we're growing. And this is a trade-off that a lot of retailers are willing to make. If you provide growth, then, we're not going to come to you for margins. If you're stagnant, like you need to be helping us grow the business and grow the output of the business. And so you need to be improving your margin profile. And this is similar for the physical retailers. For a long time, they could grow their store count. But at this point, Walmart, Target, they're pretty big. They have a lot of locations. So that's not going to provide the growth. The other one that they would really use is, hey, we're going to white label more stuff. Like we're going to, and you can see this like in the food section as Walmart and Target, or Target's clothing section. Like it's almost all white label. And they really hit that strategy for a while to grow earnings. But at this point, they've kind of taken that as far as they can go.
Yeah.
So it'll be really interesting to see what happens. Does that mean, and to some extent, does that lead to more inflation? How does that go? Certainly the way that it's gone the last 2 or 3 years.
Wait, why would that lead to more inflation?
Well, because they've got to grow. They have fiduciary duty to their shareholders, and so how do you do that? If you can't expand stores and you can't increase your margin profile on what you're already selling, you either go to sellers and say, hey, I've got to have better prices from you, more fees, which is what you're alluding to, or you get people to buy more. And those are kind of your levers. And I think as, Walmart and Target have kind of moved towards maturity. And even with Amazon, they're asking the same questions. The difference with Amazon, as a side note, is that they have this unbelievable advertising business, and they have AWS. They have a logistics business. So they have more levers, I think, of ways that they can continue to grow profits.
Did you build that relationship with Amazon because you were selling enough, like wholesaling to them, or was that just a strategy out the gate?
Yeah, no. So the reason why we sold with Amazon right out the gate is it's the only person who would sell us. So, it was a pretty easy decision that no buyer's going to say yes. Who's the person that will say yes? And we got to a scale by the end of 2019 where Amazon was like, you're getting big enough. We feel like we need to have a direct relationship with you. Interestingly, their kind of 3P side, which is the consignment side, marketplace side, and their 1P wholesale side, they're kind of competitive with each other. So even though they're the same company, they kind of compete with each other. But the wholesale side of the business recruited us, and we made the decision to do it. We knew when we switched over to being a direct seller with Amazon that it was going to be extremely disruptive. And so we plotted this all out, Chris, where we were going to do a deal of the day. And then on a Friday, we were going to kind of flip the switch and everything would break, but it'd be broken for like a week or two. And then Amazon would have a lot of people there to help. And then we'd be back up and running. And the week that we picked was the second week of March 2020. So literally, we do a deal of the day, we flip the switch, everything breaks. 4 or 5 days later, COVID goes bananas, and there's the stay-at-home orders, and Amazon is all of a sudden just totally gasping for air, trying to keep up with demand, and all of our stuff is broken. And it was easily one of the scariest times in the business, where like this incredible business that we built with Amazon almost overnight, kind of like, like a Greek tragedy, had just kind of like fallen apart because of, external circumstances. And then Amazon was so overwhelmed with demand that they had to go through, and they couldn't offer 2-day Prime on their entire catalog. So Amazon decided what we're going to do is we're going to pick our top 10% of SKUs, and we're going to give 2-day delivery on that. And we're going to take everything else to a month or 2 months of delivery. So we woke up one day and, a portion of our catalog had 2-day delivery, and it was now selling at 3x or 4x the pace we were ready for. And then the other, chunk of our catalog was now 1 to 2 month delivery, and nobody was buying it. And so that was a That was not a great, it was not a great period. It was pretty challenging.
What did you do? Like, how did you,
Yeah.
from a leadership standpoint, you said like this Greek tragedy where the whole business is melting down.
Yeah.
What did you do?
Well, the first thing that I did is I messaged the team that I believe we're going to get through this. If we have to cut back, it's coming out of leadership first. Like my salary is going down, the leadership salary is going down first. I am not going to lay people off. I'm going to do everything I can to retain people's jobs. And fortunately, probably the other thing we did is, and I think was noteworthy at the time, our company has this commitment to giving 10% of profits. And we realized like, wow, like this is about as good a giving opportunity as you'll ever get. I mean, there was a week where the unemployment rate went from like 5% to 16%. And so we decided we're going to go ahead and do all of our giving for the year, even in light of all this uncertainty. And to me, it was a foundational moment because the way that your company values are really values is that you can point to times that it has really cost you something to hold those up and that you can tell those stories. And that was an example for us. Okay, we say we're about generosity. Is that generosity when everything's selling and everything's great? Or is that generosity like when there's actual need and it's scary outside? Another thing that happened during that same period, Target came to us and said, listen, we're not making a commentary on the future of the relationship, but for the next few weeks, we cannot buy from you. We've got to put all of our POs have to be towards essential items, masks and hand sanitizer and stuff. And it was probably the first time where I was like, are we going to be okay? I wasn't sure. And it was especially frustrating because in the very early days, at least of our company, it always felt like the company could die. It felt like we were a couple of really bad orders away from like being in real financial trouble. And we had just kind of gotten over the hump. It felt like as we went into 2020 of like, oh, okay. We're not like on life support anymore. We've got some margin. And then that was right when COVID hit. And so it felt like, oh man, right when I thought, we were kind of out of this period, we weren't. And yet we made the decision of like, hey, it doesn't matter. We're going to lean into what we say we're about. And then as you can imagine, that really matters on the other side, that it really is a way for everyone that's a part of your organization or your team to know that you're serious about what you say. So it's probably the defining memory was that month. And we were lucky, COVID, it became obvious pretty quickly. We weren't going to have some kind of zombie apocalypse. Like everything wasn't falling apart. Things came back online. It worked out. But there were still some pretty intentional choices that we made that have, I think even today, have impacted the culture.
All right. Why in 2023 did you decide to become an ESOP?
So there's kind of 2 or 3 different answers here. The first is my net worth is so far in excess of what I need. And listen, I'm a huge believer in capitalism. And I think that the profits create capital for investment so that we can build things and enjoy a standard of living that would be impossible otherwise. But I also think this idea that just there's no responsibility that comes with that is just a flawed idea. There's a verse in the Bible, to those who much is given, much is expected. And one of the ways that I communicate this often is, listen, I get the opportunity, but I also have the responsibility to be thoughtful about money. Like I'm fortunate, financially, and I'm in a very fortunate position. And there's a lot of people that built that company with me that didn't have equity, So I've got this outcome where I'm making, whatever, this crazy number with a whole bunch of zeros, and they're earning a regular salary. And on paper, it was really as simple as, I might come out with 90% as much as I would otherwise, but make a transformational financial difference in the lives of the people that built this with me. And my marginal utility, I think about this a lot, my marginal utility for money after a certain amount, and it's not a very big number, after you get to a few $1 million, it's like, unless you're just like really actively trying to spend money as like a pastime. Like you and I both know this, like there's just no more marginal utility to be had. And so my marginal utility for money at this point is just about zero. But the ability for that money to make a really big impact in, a nonprofits or, a team members of mine life, like, is pretty big. And so it's actually kind of ironically, two things are true, that, like, number one, I should want to think that way, but also number two, I get marginal utility out of money again. Like, going from $100 million to $200 million offers me no marginal utility. But if all of a sudden, if I can take that money and I can improve a whole bunch of people's lives and I can feel good about that and I can know that I'm making a difference, like, all of a sudden that money comes back into play and is, like, helpful for me again. So that was one thought, is just like, hey, opportunity and responsibility to the people that helped build this. Another thing, a lot of people do ESOPs. I did not know this beforehand, but a lot of companies do ESOPs because it provides a way to sell the company that does not involve selling it to an outside party. And, when you build something, when you put your blood, sweat, and tears into something, it's really difficult to imagine turning that over to somebody else. I think especially in our case, like, giving is a really big part of what we do. If PE came in, the very first thing they're doing is the giving is going away, and a lot of the things that made the culture special, those are going away. And they're going to want to lever this thing up and they're going to want to run it for cash flow. And then they're going to want to, sell it to somebody else. And, like, wouldn't it be awesome if there was a way for the original ownership group to be able to get liquidity, but without putting it in the hands of somebody who's not going to respect it and run it the way that we would want to. And the ESOP was a really interesting kind of way to be able to do that. And then the third reason is it's just heavily incentivized by the government. Like, there are a lot of, depending on how you structure it, and, like, listen, I've read a lot on ESOPs. I've been in a bunch of meetings. You can just about fill the Grand Canyon with everything I still don't know about ESOPs. There's people who are like, this is their whole job. But there's a lot of structures where more or less the government just takes a lot less out in taxes if you're willing to do this. And there's some examples in my market, the Oklahoma City market, where they've become full ESOPs. And so the company's completely tax-free. And as you can imagine, a company that's generating significant EBITDA that's completely tax-free just becomes an absolute machine in terms of being able to go and acquire things or invest in things. And so there's some pretty compelling options there. But I think more than anything else for me, it was, and I guess I'll say one more, like, listen, you're aligned. You want people to think like owners, make them owners, right? All the time we'll hear entrepreneurs like, why can't you think like an owner? And it's like, because they're not situated the same as you. Like, they don't have the upside you have. And so, like, I want all of our people to think like owners. And again, going back to what are the selfish benefits for me? Well, if I've got an organization full of capable people that think like owners, I'm not handcuffed to the business, and that's, for me, people will ask me sometimes, how do you sleep at night? How well do you sleep at night? I'm like, I sleep like a baby, like, I don't worry about stuff. I've got a lot of capable people that are incentivized the same way that I am, that are running the business. And so I'm able to still have a reasonable stress level and a good quality of life, even though the company's gotten quite complex.
Is there a reason why you did it in 2023? Was there an inflection point? Were employees asking for this? Like, why didn't you do it out the gate? I'm really curious how you came. Why was 2023 the year you did it?
So our company had a massive valuation spike in 23. I would guess that we went from being about $150 million company to about a $300 million company. And so, the incentive, if you're really, like, in it for your employees, then you want them to get it. It's just like a stock. It's like the earlier they buy in, the more upside they have. And so I think that there was a point where we were looking at it in early 23 and I just said, hey, we got too much going on. I'm not going to do it. And then I saw how much the business grew and it was like, well, okay, like, there is a real incentive to be decisive here and to be earlier rather than later, because I want them to be able to capture the upside they're creating.
Yeah. And if you were to start a company tomorrow from scratch, would you start out that way? Or do you think it's good to do it once a business has kind of shown maturity and shown a team that's kind of quote unquote built the company?
I think that early on, almost 100% of effort and focus should be focused on getting a product market fit, customer acquisitions, free cash flow. Like, that if you're spending a lot of time, debating kind of the, hey, what do we do if we make a lot of money kind of questions, then it's wasted effort. And I mean, here's the sad truth. The vast majority of equity that's ever been issued in small businesses is worthless. The default state is failure for small businesses. And so I think, and I think that practically it's very difficult for potential employees to value that as part of their compensation and to really count the cost. So I think it made sense for us that we were at a point where it's like, hey, this is a multi-decade company.
Yeah.
You know, we've established this thing's here and it's going to be here. And so, because when you do an ESOP, just for people who don't understand, like they get that money at retirement. So like, it's a long game. Like you're basically saying, hey, we're going to put you into this thing and the company growing plus you serving here, you're going to acquire a really significant amount of money, but you know, it's going to happen in your 50s. So when you're talking to a 20-something-year-old, it's like, well, that's great, but like I actually could use another $500 today.
Yep.
So I actually think that my guess is that the ESOP and the way that it'll be experienced is that it'll be an appreciating asset that is, as everybody that we've built the company with gets older and their ESOP accounts get bigger and they get closer and closer to the point of realizing like, wow, a big chunk of my retirement actually got taken out, you know, and provided for by this, that their appreciation for it, it will grow over time.
Okay. 2 more things. China.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Or let's just call it outsourcing overseas.
Yeah.
You've brought a lot of manufacturing back domestically, and we can talk about that if we want. I think what's interesting to me in just an inflationary environment, supply chains breaking, a restructuring of the world over the last 3 or 4 years, I would assume a lot of your product has come from overseas.
Mm-hmm.
Is that back to normal? Is it easier than it was before COVID, or is it still very challenging to work overseas?
So in general, COVID was probably the most disruptive event we've seen in the supply chain in a very long time. And it was torturous to go through it. And I think it was also a wake-up call. It was a wake-up call that the way that the world has kind of structured its supply chain is fragile and brittle in some ways. And it just got really strained in some areas and it flat out broke in some other areas. Now, when it comes to people getting their water bottles, that's unfortunate. But in certain areas like antibiotics, it was, okay, this is scary. So some of it was just like the supply chain is not particularly able to deal with disruption, because what happens is you get, almost like waves. You get a little wave, and then that creates a disruption that causes a bigger wave, which causes a bigger wave, and it just kind of ripples all the way through for an extended period of time. And in the COVID period, it was years. So I think that was kind of a wake-up call. The other piece of this is that the U.S. and Chinese governments, it's an interesting relationship at the very least. And I would say probably the most diplomatic way you could say it is the U.S. has interests and China has interests. And, this is a Venn diagram, and I don't know how much overlap there is in the middle, but there's a lot that's not overlapping. Taiwan would be a really good example. I heard this analogy and I loved it. Yeah, I think it's from Twitter somewhere. But somebody said, imagine a world where everything runs on magic. And it's a special magic dust. And there's only one place in the world you can get it. There's a little island that you can get this magic dust. And that's basically the only place you can get it. And the entire world runs on it. How would people view that island? How much would people want to control that island? Okay, that's semiconductors and that's Taiwan. That basically we are living in a world where if you want to make semiconductors, you have to, almost all of it comes from Taiwan. You cannot quickly spin up more semiconductor production, and China views Taiwan as belonging to them. And so nobody knows what happens. And I think if you're in, if you're in almost anything, but especially if you're in physical goods, the biggest question is, do the U.S. and China's interests ever diverge enough that trade stops or is greatly restricted? And if the answer is yes, nobody knows what happens. Nobody knows what happens. there's a lot of people that are trying to, I would say, mitigate risk in case that happens. So an example is you see Chinese manufacturers that are building other factories, but they're building them in kind of China's sphere of influence. You've even seen some of them go to Mexico and through joint ventures or even Chinese funded build factories in Mexico. Mexico is really kind of exploding right now. Let's say we do get into a conflict with China. Does the US government allow goods from a Chinese factory in Mexico to get in just because it's in Mexico? I don't know. I'm skeptical, but I don't know. And so nobody really knows how to mitigate the risk. It's interesting because by being a part of this push into domestic manufacturing, I end up in a lot of conversations that are kind of above my pay grade. And I can say like that at I would say a governmental level, there's some real concern. There's some real concern that China goes for it with Taiwan. There's some real concern that there's some very strained relations. So some of it is just straight up, risk mitigation. Like we got to be able to make some stuff here. We got to be able to do some things in the physical world. In our case, there's also some advantages to being able to do kind of some printing and lasering, and that we get some real advantages by having domestic production. But I think it's one of those things, Chris, where it's so complicated. In COVID, we learned something that I think every entrepreneur would do well to take from. Like, let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say I came to you in January of 2020 and said, Chris, in mid-March, COVID is going to hit the US and there's going to be stay-at-home orders. Could you have profited off that information? And the answer is maybe, but even that incredible insight into the future would not have been as helpful as you might have thought, because you'd be like, well, sure, I'm going to go short stocks. But if you'd stayed shorted stocks for even 15 days too long, you would have gotten your head cut off, or we could talk about real estate or different things. Like we saw this in a bunch of different markets, that even if you had known that, if you hadn't known some of the second and third order effects, it wouldn't have mattered. And this was the interesting thing about COVID. It was all the second and third order effects. So I think if you're an entrepreneur, what are the second and third order effects of a strained US-China relations? I don't know. Like one of the hypotheticals I've given people is, let's just say China and, the US get into a hot conflict or cold conflict. Like, does that mean I'm making all my water bottles in the US? Maybe. It might mean that I'm making drone parts in my factory. It's so hard to understand how the world looks in that world that it's difficult to plan for. But anyway, so we've gotten into that world. I can tell you that manufacturing is hard, and it's easy to understand why American companies don't want to do it, because
Why?
It's capital intensive. And Wall Street doesn't like capital intensive. Wall Street has been pretty clear that they like asset light models, and it's hard, like you have to employ people, and it's difficult to get really good, committed people at those kind of hourly wages, and the hourly wages keep going up. States are passing these kind of minimums. An interesting thing that's happening, like here's an interesting thing. Who do you think's buying the most robotics in the world? There's one country buying more robotics than anybody else combined.
I don't know.
China. So interestingly, you would say, well, if the US is going to get serious about manufacturing, we would be buying robotics like crazy. But it's not us. It's the people with lower wages. Like China is ahead of us on that they are mechanizing and automating their supply chain and their manufacturing a lot quicker than we are. And a lot of it's just willingness to invest. So we'll see. But it's been, I think for us, it's been insightful, and we are finding the ways that it helps our business to be successful. And I've talked to quite a few. The other thing is I've gotten to talk to quite a few entrepreneurs that are excited about this and that are focusing on spinning up manufacturing. So we'll see where it goes.
All right. My final question really is, we've talked about all the advantages of being online, and you've been doing this now 15 years. For somebody that's starting today, what are some of the disadvantages to selling online? And you can relate that to, it seems like there's a resurgence in selling in physical retail.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, everybody was investing in D2C. Now it's uninvestable. Like what has created a lot of these disadvantages, and how do you think about it from that perspective?
So a couple of kind of truisms that come into play here. One is that, the more competition, the harder it is to be successful and the bigger the size of the prize. So when you're first starting out as an entrepreneur and you're learning how to be a great operator, I saw this advice before and I really like it. It's like pick a very niche market where you have a small number of competitors and where your operational, like as you're learning operationally, that's not a huge negative for you and you can be successful. There's still plenty of markets, whether this is geographical constraints, regulatory constraints that have just, not great solutions out there. Like one of my things is the world always has a deficit for excellent companies. So that should be a piece of encouragement to any entrepreneur listening to this. Like there's always a need for more excellent companies, but I would start with finding something where you have some built-in advantages. And the geographical one's the easiest one to focus on. Like if you can get really good at running, a rental house company in a market, you're competing. Yeah, you've got competition, but you're not competing against, the capital from all over the United States or the world. A lot of times you can find like the nuance, how to value homes in that neighborhood. You have kind of informational advantages compared to an out of market investor. When you go to the internet, you are competing with everyone. It is just like Amazon is literally anybody in the world who wants to sell. And that is like extremely competitive. So the upside is really big. The size of prize, we grew a company to a couple $100 million in revenue in a very short period of time. That's a pretty big size of prize. But for every one Simple Modern, how many? 100, 1,000 other companies that tried it and didn't get traction because it is so competitive. So I was fortunate to develop as an operator in a more niche market. And then when those skills had really kind of crystallized, then I took my shot at a much bigger market. So that's one thing, is that it's just like a lot of the world is coming online and it's a total like competing against, I don't know, tens, hundreds, millions of people, lots and lots of people. There's another dynamic that's going on with digital, which is if you look at where people advertise, it's not that many places, right? It's like Instagram and Facebook and Google, and that's limited ad inventory. Like there's only so many hours spent on Instagram. And so it's a market and an auction system. And so, as demand grows for people to advertise their products digitally, you've got a fairly stable amount of inventory. Facebook can't really cram more ads on a page right now, and you have more people bidding for that. An example of this from my world, the kind of e-commerce D2C world, we're going to have an election in November, and Biden and Trump are going to want to spend a ton of money, and they're going to be coming in bidding whatever it takes to get that ad inventory. So you might have an e-commerce business that is fine when you're paying $8 a CPM. But guess what? Now, August of 24, it's not $8 a CPM, it's $18 a CPM. And now all your models don't work and your business is broken. So I think that that's another difficult thing, is that even if you're, in a particular vertical with your business, when you go to advertise, a lot of times you're advertising against everybody else. It could be you bidding versus Toyota for some ad space. And obviously like you've got a very different lifetime user value. So I think that those are some of the dynamics that are making it more challenging. And yet the other part of the internet is that the long tail is really freaking long. So I heard this analogy once and I loved it. If you go to Japan, there will be, like Tokyo, there'll be stores like 80s vinyl records. Like that's all they sell. And you're like, how in the world? Like that is so specific. Like how in the world does that work? And it's like, well, it's in Tokyo. There's like so many people that even this like super, specific thing can work just because of the volume of people. Well, the internet's like that you can be like, you know what? I am like the world's expert on, whatever Pikachu Pokemon cards made in the 90s. Yeah. And I'm just the expert. And you can probably have a good living. You're not going to be doing $200 million in annual revenue, but like you could probably have a business there by doing that. And so that's the really cool thing about the internet, I think for anybody, is that if you have something that you're really passionate about, that the internet brings, like, hey, there might be one person out of every 100,000 that cares about, your Pikachu cards and this time specific Pikachu card. But The world has 8 billion people, and they might be spread out all over the world, where if you created that shop in the middle of Norman, Oklahoma, literally nobody would come to it. But on the internet, right, all those people can come to it, and there might be only a few thousand of them, but that's enough to have an awesome business. And so that's the power of the internet. And I think most of the entrepreneurs that are successful, they're able to build communities around that. They're not trying to attack the really big markets. They're instead picking a manageable niche that makes it possible to gather a lot of people that are spread out around the globe.
And real quick, a lot of people would say, from my limited knowledge on e-commerce, it's as much about marketing as it is about anything. Obviously, product has to be good.
Yeah.
When Apple changed the algorithm, Twitter for like months was like, oh my gosh,
freaking out.
Facebook ads are going nuts.
Yep.
Has everybody kind of evolved from that? Did that put a permanent dent in ad spend? What did that do, and how have people evolved from it? Or how do y'all think about your ad spend?
It just keeps raising the bar, I think, is the way I would say it, is to be competitive. You just, that was probably, the executioner for a bunch of businesses, sadly. And it took a bunch of other businesses that were profitable to kind of break even affairs. And so as the internet continues to mature and you get more and more people online, just the bar for success is going to get higher as competition gets higher. So now I love competition, but part of the point of building a business is that hopefully it's sustainable and that you're not constantly dealing with people that could take your market share. So I think I would probably end with this. When I give advice to potential entrepreneurs, the two things that I really hammer on is you should think about moats and competitive advantages, sustainable competitive advantages now, before you get started. Because the most depressing idea in the world is you put all your heart and soul into something, you build it, you get traction, and then you realize you can't hold on to it. And then the second thing is you got to figure out how you're going to acquire customers. Most business plans, their fatal flaw is that they don't really know how they're going to acquire customers at an affordable rate and acquire enough of them. And so if you have those two things, whether we're talking about a digital business or a physical business, then usually you've got enough to build something that has value.
Yep. Mike, this was awesome.
Great talking, Chris.
Thanks.